What we have here is, this is one of the few sessions we're doing during the conference where we're leaving everybody in the room because we thought it was important for you all to hear about this. One of the Pipeline Safety Trust's initiatives and priorities over the last, probably ever since San Bruno, but certainly in the last 5 years, is trying to figure out a better way for the public to engage with the pipeline industry and pipeline regulators. You know, if you look around at even minor things with pipelines, often we don't communicate very well with each other. So we were pushing that for a number of years. We kind of have two panels up here. The first one is going to be me speaking along with Shawn that just got the NTSB coin, and Alan from PHMSA. I have their titles up there, and if you use your fancy QR code on the back of your thing, you can read their bios. I'm not going to do those long introductions because we'd really be long way over time then. Shawn and Alan and I are going to talk a little bit about where this new public engagement standard, which is referred to as RP 1185, isn't that a sexy name, came from and why we thought it was important. And it's really been a work in progress for, like I said, 5 years. The reality is, you know, it came from multiple places. We talk a lot about the three-legged stool, the industry, government, and public members. And this was done by API, which wasn't our first choice. We thought PHMSA perhaps should take the lead on coming up with a public engagement standard, being kind of the regulator in between the public and the industry. I think in the long run, maybe we think now that doing it through an API standard, because they do standards and public and recommended practices all the time, turned out to be a good thing. This came about from a variety of places. You know, I think everybody, the industry, the public, and regulators all recognize that we don't communicate very well. We don't share information very well. We wanted to find a better way to do that. PHMSA gave the Pipeline Safety Trust a grant to kind of investigate that idea, and we held a number of public meetings for a couple of years and came out with some recommendations. And then when PHMSA really couldn't do this because of resource limitations and other reasons, API volunteered to take it on as part of their accredited standards and run it through them. So that was good. We've been part of a number of API standard efforts, and we always have some concerns with that because while they say their standard development is balanced from a public standpoint, we don't see it being very balanced very often. But this effort was really different. There's 24 voting members, 8 of them from the industry, 8 of them from government, and 8 of them from the public. And that we felt very strongly about that. And API and PHMSA supported that idea. And that's the way this was developed. You know, and I can't say enough about how important that balanced structure was. I don't know, Alan, Shawn, anything you would add? Was that good, bad, indifferent?
Critical importance. Yeah. Now, Shawn, why don't you start?
Right. I feel like Alan and I are doing a duet here. We're sharing the microphone. Yeah. So if we start singing, you know, I think the process, what was really neat about this RP is there wasn't a mandate to go do this, but there was a need. And people from all 3 legs of the stool, which is just so happens to be the motto of this conference, is the same 3 legs of the stool, came together to put this together. And I think what's really neat about it is there's a balance there. I credit some of the members of the public for ensuring that we do that this way. Simona, I don't know if she's out there, but she was a big champion of that. Others also were saying, hey, we need to have a balance. The other thing that I think was really important was, and Chuck Lesniak is up here, but you know, we've talked about public engagement for a long time. And it was almost, I'll never forget, this was very early in the process. We sat around the table and we had a great half day and we were talking. And Chuck all of a sudden stops us and he says, you know, I feel like we are in a time warp. We're talking about this over and over again. When are we going to stop talking about it and do something about it? And that really propelled us to where we're at today, to having something as a foundation that can carry us forward. So, you know, not only the current generation, but the next generation can make it better and quit talking about the same fallacies that we've failed before at. You know, I've enjoyed coming to this conference so often because I get to hear from so many of you, boy, had we just had a simple discussion, I may not be here today. And I think that's what's important about this 1185 and that process.
I think the importance of balance is just incredibly necessary for this process. For many of you that know how we operate, we strive for balance and getting input from all the stakeholders. So that was so critical for this. We had looked at setting up a working group to address public engagement because we had seen issues over the years with, observations, direct observations, landowner issues, abandoned pipeline issues, you name it. We needed to do better. We need to evolve with the environment around us. So it was very necessary to do something. We recognized our role as the regulator to need to exert leadership in this area. And in looking to stand up a committee, we looked internally and thought, well, that would be ideal. And we've done that before, bringing in different stakeholders. But at the time, the environment just wasn't there to set up what was considered another group under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And that's where we kind of zeroed in on the ANSI process that API offers through developing a recommended practice that seemed to work and also involve a variety of stakeholders. So we ended up there, and it's worked out quite well, as you'll hopefully hear in the coming, as all of us talk up here.
And one thing that I just want to make clear, API already has a recommended practice on public awareness that PHMSA has adopted into the regulations. So companies now are required to do that public awareness. Public awareness tends to be a one-way communication. It's what the industry and the regulators and a lot of us think are really important things. Call before you dig, how to identify if there's a problem, outreach to local government so they know about pipelines in their area. This is very different. This is two-way communications. Either of you have a thought on how this differs from 1162, which is the public awareness, which is a rule at this point? This will just be a recommended practice.
Well, the way I like to put it is public awareness is leading the horse to water, and public engagement is getting the horse to drink. It's probably overly simplified. It's much more complex than that. I know, and as we got into the process of identifying a recommended practice, there are just so many moving parts. It's a very complex system to establish communication and true communication and build trust.
I'll state the simple. To me, public awareness is a transaction. It's a one-way. Engagement is a two-way in a discussion. And we have never taken the time to figure out what's that two-way look like. Again, how do you make that sustainable? And that's what this document's about. It's easy to talk about the one-way, but the more important, really needle mover for me is the two-way.
So I want to talk a little bit about where this recommended practice is right now. This is kind of the timeline that started at the beginning of this year. We had been meeting for a whole year before this. I think we had 70 some technical group meetings. We were doing it once or twice a month to begin with. We've been doing it a little slower since then, but the recommended practice just was finalized and went out for a vote and public comment yesterday. And there'll be a link at the bottom if anybody wants to read it and comment. We would really like to get your comments back. But we've worked through all of this. It's a done deal now. It's went out for comment and a vote. I think we'll get a positive vote because we already polled all 24 voting members, and everybody's shaking their heads in the right direction. Could change once we see comments, but we'll see. That will probably, the comment period's open until the end of January. And then we have to address every comment we get. So we hope we don't get 1,500 comments. We hope we get, a handful of really good ones, but you're welcome to comment. We hope to have it all done, and it'll be finalized and adopted sometime in the spring. I think April is the hopeful date. Might take a little longer than that. And then PHMSA always has the ability to make it part of the regulations. And Alan's kind of said that out loud. I don't know if you have any comments on that or not.
Well, like Carl mentioned, we've already incorporated by reference APRP 1162, which is public awareness. We have the ability, as this comes out, to also incorporate this by reference. And that will certainly be a topic of discussion. We would have to go through the process of notice and comment, notice a proposed rulemaking to adopt a standard, this new standard, but that's kind of the process that happens. And, our approach right now, we've been engaged in the process, and we'll see as far as where the chips fall in the future. I would expect at some point it will be incorporated by reference as a code requirement. Because right now, as you may know, as it comes out, as it gets finalized, it would not be a requirement, but it's a recommended practice. It's only when it gets put into the code, into part 192 for the gas code or 195 for the liquid code, that it would then become a requirement. But that said, we fully expect, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, how do we expect this to be successful? We fully expect that everyone will embrace this standard. It's really a good standard.
So just to tell you a little bit about what is actually in the standard, we have some core principles. And if you read through these core principles, it looks like something that would come out of a social studies class or something, not out of an API recommended practice. We're talking a lot about openness and transparency and respect and reciprocity and inclusiveness and accessibility and equity. Those are not things you read about much in API standards. And this group really kind of went above and beyond to embrace these things and include that throughout the whole recommended practice. So we hope you'll look at that and see if we've done a good job of it. Any comments on any of those, or should we? The other thing it does, and this one slid off. Well, you can see it. Everybody's staring at the floor up here. That's because we have a screen up here. They're not really looking at Aaron's shoes. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one more thing. Can you go back one slide? Really, if you look at these core principles, and I like to say that, if you don't have the first two, openness and transparency and respect, really the rest are very difficult. A lot of times we'll see that maybe one event occurred between, say, a landowner and an operator that really got the ball rolling, got things off to a bad start, and really negatively impacts your ability to work together as you go forward. And that can even happen to us as a regulator as well. But those two, having the openness, the transparency, and respect to work together. And this is something that we've seen has been just greatly in need as we see all the projects that are constructed, for instance, that there are issues of heavy-handedness. Maybe the first contact with a landowner might be through a right-of-way agent. Maybe there's a different approach to kind of establish this long-term relationship that's built more on, two-way dialogue. But anyway, and this also, it just speaks to a change in culture of how we handle public engagement.
Yeah, I'll just mention Carl. Carl and I did a podcast on public engagement, I don't know, a year or so ago. And one of the things that just kept coming back as Russell Treat was asking us about the document was, it's really, these principles are things we learned in kindergarten. And that's what this is about. It's really, and then and putting that on paper. And we literally started with a blank piece of paper. There was no book that we followed. There's nothing. So what you'll see in this document was really done by that balanced approach, that three-legged stool based on these principles.
And you can imagine that's why we had 70 meetings. You put people from public interest groups and people from the industry together and try to define what equity or inclusiveness is. And there was a few meetings right there.
Yep.
And, a lot of it relates to environmental justice, which you're going to hear about throughout the conference. And, there's lots of environmental justice issues built into this new recommended practice. Some of the other core things that we did is part of this relates to other things, like Jennifer just mentioned, safety management systems. There's a recommended practice that the industry's really been pushing hard on to implement safety management systems for a number of years now. That's not a rule or a regulation yet, because the industry's really pushed hard and is doing it without it becoming a rule. But what it says in that safety management system is you need to do public engagement, but it doesn't tell you what public engagement is. It just says you need to do it. So this fills that void of telling people what public engagement ought to look like. And these are some of the types of language that the industry likes: flexibility and scalability and integration and continuous improvement, that really relates to safety management systems and other things. And you were involved very much with safety management systems, Shawn. Comments?
I I think, for me, the biggest changer for our industry has been this, safety management system. You talked earlier, Jennifer talked about Bruce's leadership, and I've so enjoyed getting to know him regarding safety management system and the change he can bring about. This 1185 is under that same umbrella. So all those terms did come from that same qualitative, not, prescriptive, because there isn't one size that fits all. You've got big operators, small operators, gas, liquids, and we want public engagement doesn't fit, it's got to be fit for purpose. And that's the basis of why it was set up under 1173 or safety management system, because it has been a needle mover. We've got a long ways to go. And I'm encouraged to get the journey started on public engagement under the same framework.
So really the core of the whole RP, there's 6 major elements of it, and there's requirements under each of these elements of how you do this. And we're just going to talk really briefly about the 6. I think Shawn's going to take the first 2 and I'll clean up.
Yeah, we'll quickly go around these because again, it's the basis of the document, but it's also meant to be a little bit of almost a quick Cliff Notes version. The first one I'll start with is at the top, the commit and align. And that really starts with the operator of at the very top committing to doing public engagement and being committed to that, not to check a box, but to have a relationship. I'm often amazed that when something doesn't go right, between the public and an operator, the CEO or the president, as they look back, they kind of say, how did we end up here? Some of it is you got to commit to that we're going to engage and not just do awareness, go beyond that and have real discussions. And just as Jennifer said in her opening, that, sometimes it's not, you don't go into it hoping you hear what you want to hear. You need to hear what you need to hear. And sometimes that'll be in disagreement with what you think. And that's that commitment to do that. The next is to identify, understand, and confirm the stakeholders. That sounds easy, but we've all been in the situation is, oh, I forgot you. And no one feels worse than the person that got forgot. And our goal is right up front, let's identify those and make sure we've been comprehensive. Because again, that one person that you forget may be the game changer that defines between success, what went right, what went wrong. And I think that's really important in how to do that in a formal way.
Yeah, the next one is plan and prepare, because once you identify stakeholders, and if you have a pipeline that's running 2,000 miles, you're going to have a lot of stakeholders identified. And in understanding them is even more difficult. What are their interests? Why do they care about pipelines? Then you need to plan how you're going to implement that stuff. The 4th one is share information. Stakeholders can plug into this whenever they want. If you get a bee in your bonnet about a pipeline, you might contact a company. So the companies need to be ready for that and ready to share information, but they also need to start the conversations often. So share information also is how pipeline companies, whether it's a new pipeline or they're going to do a dig on a pipeline, are going to get information out to all those stakeholders that are identified to start the conversations and the engagement. And then finally, maybe the most important one is how are you going to listen to what you get back? Because we've all been through workshops that seem like they're just hoop jumps. Okay, this had a workshop, we came in and we testified for 2 hours and then they did what they wanted anyway. Well, that's what we're trying to avoid. We really want people to listen to what's going on and then change the way they do based on what they hear. And the final one, which completes the loop, is continuous improvement. And
yeah, I personally believe this is the most important step. This is about being a learning system. Sometimes it's easy to run past that and just start over again. But if you really want to make a change, you better do the monitor, evaluate, and adjust well. And we all know, and as we talk in human relationships, we all can, boy, I wish I wouldn't have said it that way. I wish I would have done something. I wish I would have approached him earlier. There's things on all 3 legs of the stool to improve upon. And to me, it's the most important step, but it's also the hardest.
And we have lots of fancy charts like this. Oh boy, decision trees. You don't know how much time we spent coming up with how do you share information. And this is a decision tree where, oftentimes the public feels like what the industry is looking for is a way to say, no, I want some information, and no, you're not going to get that. It's security sensitive, or it's proprietary or something. We really worked through a decision tree trying to get people to, how do you get to say yes? How do you give people information they want? We're flipping it around, and I think, you know, everybody embraced this in the end. We had a number of discussions that took a while on this.
Yeah, hey, Carl, I'll just comment on that. We were, as a group, we were somewhat at a stalemate how to do this. And there was all kinds of different opinions. And I credit Carl for coming up with this decision tree, because it probably documented what we all meant, but we couldn't either remember what each other was saying or understand our intent. And everyone could get behind it. And to me, one of the neat things about this team is we had to engage and actually do engagement to get to where we're at today. And we listened and learned. And again, we didn't start off with doing a decision tree. We were at a stalemate. And Carl said, let me try to put something on paper, and this is what we came up with. So blame him.
They changed some of my arrows around as we talked about it, don't
If I can add, yeah, this went through several iterations, as you can imagine. It was probably one of the toughest areas we dealt with. We had lists of examples of things you might share. And, you know, as a regulator, my view of a list is they're great. They can be comprehensive, but you always miss something. So really, we needed to develop a process. It looks daunting, but it works. And one thing I always tell people, if you lead off with no, you can't have that, you know, that's the worst. You've got to find a way to work with people. This little flow chart here will provide that mechanism to work and find a way to share information.
I've already talked a little bit about what's next. Like I said, it's out for public comment right now as of yesterday until the end of January. And then we have to reconcile those comments we get, and then it will get published, and implementation will start. The person, you want to talk a little bit about how the industry implements recommended practices, and pick on somebody out in the crowd that might have something to do with that?
Yeah, I want to ask Andrea Grover just to stand up real briefly. Andrea is from Enbridge. She's going to be leading the industry implementation team. And that sounds, okay, that's kind of simple. It's probably going to be the toughest job, even what we had just gone through to get where we're at today. It's a multi-year journey. To me, it's the X factor of how well the effectiveness of this document ends up being, how well we do implementation. And sometimes they think, well, you just got to read it and go do it. It's not like that. What's that look like for the flexible, scalable, the small operator, the big operator? And Andrea has got a cross-functional team, including Carl and Chuck are going to be advisors on it to help give insight of what are we missing. And I look forward to their progress. And again, I think as we all see, you know, over the next few years, it's a journey, just like I said many times on SMS, not a destination. We just need to keep ensuring we check and adjust, keep learning and growing, and we will move the needle, and Andrea is going to help us lead that effort. So, I'm sorry, Carl, it is already underway. One of the things that the team did, and we learned this from SMS, the earlier you kind of start engaging the implementation team, the better. And so we started them a few months ago. Even before we went to ballot. We knew where we were going to be, but we wanted to start, so they've already hit the ground running. So it's not like, well, we'll wait to the ballot, then we'll go implement. It's already started, so there's been a nice overlap. So the implementation team has seen the intent of the people up on the 1185. What was our intent? Now, you know, we're not smart enough to say, what's that look like out in reality? They can help us put that together.
And I've already switched the slide, and this is how, if you want to comment, this tells you how to do that. It's you go to the API website, and you can download the RP, and you make comments. Their system is not particularly user-friendly. They have an Excel spreadsheet, and you have to comment in this spreadsheet and send it in certain ways, but it's not all that complicated. So, and if you need help, let us know. We're glad to help you do that. Now, the rest of these people who sat quietly, which I'm just amazed at, actually, are some of the public members that took part in the RP, and we thought it would be interesting to put those up. I'm just going to introduce them real quickly. Jessica is the executive director of TRED, from Texas. Treads is like, don't tread on me, property rights type stuff. Kirk Jalbert is a professor at Arizona State University. Chuck Lesniak's been at this for a long time. He used to be with the city of Austin, Texas, and now he's a consultant. Gerard, the Honorable Mayor Gerard Neugebauer from Greene, Ohio. Who did I miss? Greg Perry, Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, and he has other hats he wears too. And David Kane runs Windhorse Strategies Initiative, Boulder, Colorado, which works mainly with indigenous groups around the country. So folks, before I even jump in on questions for you, you just listen to the three of us try to explain what this has been for the last 2 or 3 years. Anybody hear anything they want to talk about? Question?
You know, one of the things that is important to me about this is that the industry understands and the people that look at this understand, and as you think about it, as you comment, is that in my mind, this is intended to be a paradigm shift. I'm sure all of you, industry, public, government, have all dealt with situations in new pipelines, post-incidents, that sort of thing, where the discussions, the conversations just didn't go well. And that I came from government where the public owned our information. We shared everything unless there was some really, really good reason why we couldn't share it. And when somebody asked us for information, we didn't get to make a judgment call. We weren't allowed to make a judgment call about whether or not the requester should have that information or could understand that information. That wasn't our job, and we weren't allowed to do that. To some extent, that's what this is intended to do, is just try to get the industry to share information and be transparent without making a judgment about whether or not the requester is qualified to understand that information, whether they should have that information, but to just give it to them and help them understand it and have a dialogue that is truly based on a shared set of facts.
That's a great segue, and I'd like to put Jessica on the spot because Jessica's worked a lot with new pipelines in Texas going into place, and I was wondering when you've worked on this recommended practice, part of it is we're hoping it helps build trust and transparency between landowners and operators. Do you think this can improve, the way pipeline routing process for landowners works and deal with some of those tensions we always see?
Yes, I would agree. Can everyone hear me? I would agree with that. Texas is a unique environment because 95% of the land in Texas is privately owned, and about 84% of that is rural. So the landowner is really a key stakeholder in all of these discussions and projects specific to Texas. And so having these types of standards is really helpful for transparency and communication, but also where we see it is helping streamline the process for construction of a pipeline. One of the things that we have experienced is that, not all operators are created equal, which is why we want these kinds of standards to create best practices. In Texas, there's little or no regulation and permitting that is required for a pipeline. And so this kind of allows for the good operators to show up, work with landowners and other key stakeholders in order to, execute the project, but also kind of shines a light on the operators who aren't as, up and up on things. And what we've seen, the success of not only the construction and, getting the product online a lot faster, is when a landowner has a seat at the table. There are public hearings, there's comment, all of the routes are evaluated. Something that TRED has been advocating for is a full-blown routing process that would go through the Public Utility Commission in Texas, but also work with the Railroad Commission. We're an interesting dynamic with agencies in our state. And really, it's just a matter of helping industry get their job done, but also making sure that all the key stakeholders are aware of what's going on. And really the best stewards are the ones who own the land, which is the landowner. So this, in my opinion, has been a great start. It's been a wonderful education for me and my membership. And so we're hoping to take some of the things that we've learned in the application of these standards to apply what we can do personally in our state to help streamline this process and keep this relationship going.
Thanks, Jessica. And we are going to give all of you a chance to ask us questions, but Some of you may know that I spent 12 years as an elected county commissioner. I'm still recovering from that adventure. But it really made me, I got a call out of the blue from Greene, Ohio. I can't remember how many years ago that was now, and that's where I met Mayor Neugebauer. And as an elected mayor, you seem to, at that time, have been caught between the people you were elected to represent and a huge gas transmission pipeline that was proposed right through your community. So you were in the crossfire. No matter what you did, people were mad at you. Through this RP, your powers were extremely, to influence that interstate pipeline were really small. I mean, you tried, but your power was pretty small. Do you think this RP can change the dynamic that you were caught in the crossfire of?
Yeah. So getting caught in a crossfire, maybe not the best way to describe it. As a local elected official, I was clearly on the side of the public landowners. And even on the three-legged stool, we've had this discussion many times, that I'm included in government, but there's a big difference between regulatory agencies, the federal and state level, and a local official who's representing the people. So I was clearly on the side of the residents, and we were trying to help the residents through this process. And it was very difficult and very frustrating. So I'm probably least qualified in this room to talk about this issue, because I was just like a member of the public. I was dragged in because a pipeline was coming through our city. Another unique factor is that, many times these are sited through rural areas, and in this case, it was decided to come through a suburban city with a lot of impacted landowners, and so it was a very unique situation. I think that by starting this process, and I think the industry bears a lot of weight in making this happen, it sets the stage, I think, for a much better process of engaging the residents and making somebody in my position, our job, a lot easier. It doesn't help the cause. It doesn't help. You can't help your residents if you can't get the information that they can't get. I had no more access to that than the public did. And so this process of feeling like you can include the public in the process, give them the information that they may need. Sometimes it may seem contrary to the goal of the industry to do this, and I think that ultimately this is going to improve the success of the industry. It may cost less money in the long run to do the things up front that set the equation right for the public, and I hope that the industry can see this and really feel this. And I know Shawn Lyons, I've worked with him for the last 5 years, and you can see the passion that he has to do the things that are necessary, and I think the industry can take note of how that approach really is a model of success, and ultimately will be cost effective in your job. So I appreciate being involved in this, and it's been very rewarding, but something I never expected to be involved as a local official.
Me neither. Greg Perry is a farmer from Pennsylvania, but he wears different hats because he also has expertise. He is a consultant on corrosion and pipeline integrity. So joining the public caucus of this thing, he brought lots of expertise to it. One of the issues that Greg really pushed us on was information sharing, because he's seen how difficult it is for particularly the farm community to get their hands on information, especially technical information. If a farmer asks a pipeline company I want to see your integrity management plan, they usually don't get very far. Want to talk about that a little, Greg, and how this might change that?
Well, I think the implementation will tell in the long run how this is going to work. But I'm tentatively hopeful. As Carl said, it came as a bit of a surprise to me that I became a farmer, because I married a farmer. And one of the things that really astonished me when I got more involved in farming and more involved in the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau is the level of technical acumen that is basically required of modern farmers in order to become successful. It really was quite impressive. But yes, I did become involved in the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, and through them, part of their policy development process, which is like all state farm bureaus and the National Farm Bureau, quite an involved and well-refined process. And the American Farm Bureau has a good bit of policy already on pipelines. They're generally in favor of the fuels that they provide. They need a lot of fuel. There are some issues with eminent domain, but one of the things that they have specifically on the books is that they're interested in condition reports. And by that I mean evaluations of the conditions of the pipelines. How RP 1185, I think, might affect this relationship. Well, farmers and farming communities can sometimes be pretty reluctant to new things and to new people coming into their community. And they can be a little standoffish about getting involved. I think it's really important when a new pipeline is coming through, and in some cases where a pipeline that's been there for quite a while that nobody knows about, with the engagement process, it's really important to reach out to farmers, to let them know the importance of getting involved early on, because some of them can be quite fatalistic about aspects of pipeline safety. They tend to see that all going to the attention of the city people that make a lot of noise about what they care about. So that they do need a bit of reach out and encouragement. But when you do get involved with them, they've got very specific concerns. They care a lot about things like slope, drainage. They have a lot of underground drain tile. And of course, they have their surface operations that they're very interested in being able to do. Oftentimes, they have very limited windows to do the farming things that they need to do. But I think you can find that farmers care very deeply about issues like sustainability and conservation. So, they do have an interest in the pipeline that is going through. I think once they are engaged with, they could be welcoming. They would like to see pipelines become part of their communities. And of course, the personnel involved with pipelines. And they want information. They want to know about the safety and what's being done to help them.
Great, thanks, Greg. One of the things we really struggled with was the RP. Like I mentioned, we spent a lot of time dealing with environmental justice, and one aspect of that was indigenous rights. We have lots of, you haven't had to pay much attention to the news to know that sometimes pipeline issues go wrong when you start dealing with tribal communities. We had one of the 24 voting members was from a tribe. Travis, has Travis showed up yet? There he is, right there. Travis was part of the RP as part of that. And David Kane, who has a consultancy out of Colorado, works mainly with indigenous groups. How do you see this RP perhaps helping with some of those relations?
Yeah, I could talk about this for a whole day.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. I just first want to acknowledge that for all of you here, most of you are probably landowners in some form or another, own a home on some land. And I want to acknowledge that there are over 20 tribes that in this area of New Orleans who occupied this land traditionally and historically. So I want to acknowledge that. I won't list all of them, but there are at least 20 tribes, probably more bands that I know of. So I just want to acknowledge that. As far as I was really happy to participate in the RP and what the long way and the progress that we made. I do want to make a couple comments about the use of the term public and stakeholders, which is a term we've fought over pretty intensely as we went through the RP. I just want to recognize too, and I think it's important for industry and regulators to acknowledge that tribes are not the public. They have guaranteed rights in the U.S. Constitution and special rights, also in the 14th Amendment. So we have to recognize that when we're engaging tribes. We hear these terms consultation, government consultation all the time. And this RP makes a pretty big step in terms of doing that. Having said that, I'm a white guy. I work with tribes. I have a lot of contacts with people who are indigenous attorneys, various people in indigenous governments. Many of these people don't trust this RP, that it's going to make any difference for them. I'll just say that flat out. I've polled over 40 people that I've talked to, and they'll probably make some public comments, but they don't particularly aren't. So it's going to really fall on government and industry to prove that they are true to this. And having said that, recognizing the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. This is something that's very important to Indigenous people across the country, across the globe. If you followed COP27, there were a lot of discussions with Indigenous groups about how they fit in the decision-making process and how they've been excluded from that in a lot of ways. And people also hear a lot about these land back issues. Rest assured, Indigenous people they are asking for some of their lands back, their traditional homelands and their traditional practices. But I think the RP makes makes an effort towards doing that. So my hope is during the implementation that a lot better engagement happens. I think there's still a long way to go in recognizing Indigenous people and how they view the world. That includes their knowledge, which existed for 4,000 years. That's something to recognize. Science alone is not, they have scientific knowledge about things in the world that science hasn't yet touched. You can only look to the Amazon forest and things they're still discovering in the Amazon, what Indigenous people know. I think that's the only other thing is the transparency piece. I'll just call it out. Industry has tried to undermine Indigenous people in a lot of ways, spying on them. This happened at Dakota Access. This happened at other pipelines. And I want to recognize that. This is why Indigenous people don't trust a lot of what goes on with industry and government. So I just want to recognize that we're at a critical time in our country, and I'll only speak about the United States, but I work globally also, where transparency is hugely important and authenticity and engagement is important because Indigenous people feel very empowered and will continue to rise up. You hear about these things. These are not just things this is in their culture, this is in their blood. And I want to really encourage people to recognize that they don't feel disempowered. They feel like they have power. So I just want to recognize that. And I'm looking forward to, seeing this implemented and doing everything I can on a day-to-day basis to do that. So.
Great. Yeah, and I just want to do a plug for another session this afternoon because coming through this whole public engagement, looking at how Indigenous communities in the U.S. are really sovereign nations and their rights are guaranteed under the U.S. Constitution. So if you're one of those people that likes to wave around the U.S. Constitution, you're supporting, Indigenous rights. We were surprised that in Canada, the engagement with Indigenous communities has been done a little differently. So there's a session this afternoon. If you're interested in that, I encourage you to come hear that because the Canadian federal regulator is out in front on some of these issues, and we're going to hear from some of the Indigenous folks and some of those regulators this afternoon about how well that's been worked. Finally, let me get to Greg get to Kirk, and then we'll open it up for comments from you. Kirk brought a very, interesting perspective to this because he's now a professor at Arizona State University, but before that, he's worked for advocacy groups, and he's identified, I think it was several hundred, smaller groups working on pipeline issues around the country, and how they go about that and how they try to deal with pipeline issues. So I was wondering, Kirk, if you could just talk briefly about how this RP might change the way those small groups work, and also about, just with your academic hat on, what kind of assessment do we need of whether this is going to be successful or not?
Yeah, thanks for that, Carl. Yeah, I think there's a few really good points that you made. First of all, in the research that I've been doing over the last few years, and you'll see that this touches on a few of the topics we've already mentioned, that a lot of organizations that emerge in response to pipelines begin as single issue individual landowners whose concerns don't get heard or addressed. And then that results in landowners feeling disenfranchised. And then that results in landowners organizing and choosing that their only option is to stop a project, right? And that's not indicative of all organizations. Others come from different places in which they may not want a project from the beginning, but I think that it's in our best interest to realize that there's a diversity of needs that exist out in the public in terms of what they need or want from an engagement strategy. And I think that this RP starts to open that up and create a space of dialogue. Also in doing research on the many different advocacy organizations, and like you said, something like 700 organizations in this country working on various, pipeline related projects from an advocacy perspective, they really rely quite a lot on information from agencies and what small amount they can get from operators to be able to make sense of projects. And in my opinion, a better informed public is one that is able to negotiate their needs and be able to be in more educated dialogue with operators and industry when it comes time to figure out how to address those needs. And so by creating information blocks, we actually also do a disservice to what we all feel as though we need to be whole in this process, right? And the other thing I just want to say is, and this gets to what David was talking about, it's also at our disadvantage to monolithic definitions of public, right? The public is not one thing, it's many publics. And through the course of defining what we mean by the public and saying, well, there's landowners, but there's also neighboring communities, and there's also local township officials, and they all have different needs, right? And they all have different demands, and they all have different concerns. And identifying those, like really in very detailed form, was one of our tasks in this process. And what that does is that I think it sets an agenda for when operators do get approached for information, or when they do need to go out into a community, they can anticipate what kinds of conversations they need to be prepared for and how they need to be training, the individuals in their organizations who are going to be doing this work to be informed about what kinds of questions they need to field and what kinds of information they have to have with them in order to field those conversations, right? And in particular, one of the aspects of this that I was, asked to really do a heavy lift on was the environmental justice component and defining what that is and what that means. And I think that fundamentally, the indigenous rights component is part of it, but we also need to recognize that even within communities that we may not think of as environmental justice communities, there are marginalized populations that come from different starting points and have different needs. And ignoring that is the case is also to our disadvantage, because we should be thinking about this from a holistic perspective, right? And we want to make sure that we actually identify and reach out to and do that proactively, and not, assume that if we just sort of, block our ears and our eyes, then those individuals will not be a problem for us, right? And I say this because we need to be really effectively addressing historically marginalized and disproportionately burdened communities from a range of perspectives, and this industry is implicated in that in many ways. Now, something that I'm starting to get roped into quite a lot in the last year has been just this massive preparation for build out of all different kinds of infrastructure as a result of all the money that's going to be coming through the Department of Energy through the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, and tens of billions of dollars to build out things like carbon infrastructure, hydrogen infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, right? And 10% of the review requirement on these proposals you have to, as part of putting in proposals, develop Justice 40, which is 40% of the benefits of these projects need to go to historically disadvantaged communities in which the projects are going to be built. And they have to have robust community engagement protocols. One of the things that I'm discovering as I'm talking to people and as people are approaching me to be, consultants or parts of these projects, is that they have no idea how to do community engagement. And we're talking about tens of billions of dollars that are going to projects going to be built in the next decade in which they do not know how to do community engagement. And as I've been reflecting on this, I've been looking at RP 1185 and saying, what a wonderful model for community engagement. And maybe this is something that we should be thinking about propagating into the portfolios of people who are trying to, establish how to do this in other places as well. And so, I mean, I just want to say that I think it actually is a very proactive and a very meaningful document. And I really hope that the implementation team is able to be successful in helping the operators really see that and really take this to heart, because I think it really is a sea change and a paradigm shift. But proof is always in the pudding, what we choose to do with it, right? Thank you.
Great. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. We'd love to have questions from people. We've got a couple of people with microphones, at least one I see.
Me first.
Who gave her the
I
microphone?
know. So Linda Darty with PHMSA. So first a comment and then a question. The comment is, I'm actually heartened to hear that this was a difficult process for you all, because that means if you do something and it's too easy, you probably didn't do it right. So the fact that you struggled through it really put some thought and interest. That's good. That was my comment. The question I have is, oftentimes when a standard is built, it's created, a lot of effort goes into it, it's tossed over to the fence, and then it's like, yeah, y'all just go do it. And I understand there's someone that's working on an implementation team. My question is, who's the hall monitor to check on actual implementation? How well is it effectively being done? Who's going to come back in and check and say, yeah, that was successful, or, whoa, we missed the target. I see my boss up here laughing, so I must have said something I shouldn't have.
Yeah, I think you hit a bunch of nerves because I'm just itching to answer that one. And so I've got the microphone, but I won't take it for long. And first, your point about, that we struggled with it was good. There was the three legs of the stool, and you're seeing a lot of the public caucus is what we called it here. And we had lots of meetings beyond those 71 meetings. And we found out that the 8 of us don't even agree on a whole lot of stuff. So we had to struggle within our own caucus. Beth was one of those, and she's nodding her head over here. As far as, evaluation, Kirk kind of has put together an idea for how we can move forward and evaluate whether this is working or not. And so we're looking for funding to help with that. And Kirk, you can talk about that along with, and I'd love to hear from maybe Andrea or Greg about how API actually evaluates things too.
Yeah, that question is critical, and it's exactly what I'm pivoting to right now, because like I said, the proof is in the pudding, right? And so I'm trying to ramp up a multi-year study, because I feel like these few years in which 1185 hits the ground are probably the most critical, certainly from a regulatory perspective. If you're examining this as something that could get adopted as code down the road, wouldn't it be nice to know how it's actually landing, right? And I think that this has to be done in partnership with the ways in which the API implementation team is doing its own evaluation and monitoring. But I come, and my team comes with a different set of skills and abilities that can reach different audiences. And I think that fundamentally, when one is evaluating whether or not 1185 is working or not, you actually need to talk to the stakeholders and ask them, and have it be a participatory evaluation process, and say, what does success look like to you, and have we met success, right? And then finding a way in which that process of evaluation doesn't just become a thumbs up or a thumbs down on a process, but something in which, as we heard previously from NTSB, we identify what is working, identify what needs additional work to be able to work appropriately, identify unintended consequences that we didn't think about at all when we were developing the RP, and then bundle that all together and figure out what we can do with that information to actually make it so that it can be stronger in a 2.0 version or an adopted version, or wherever it might be.
Right. Now's the perfect time to get some baseline studies going, so we know where public engagement is at this point. If you ask each of us how well public engagement is doing, you're going to hear something different based on what we heard, but there's not a overall strategy out there getting baseline information, so 3 years from now we can see whether we've improved or not. Shawn, anything to add to how you guys do it?
I'll mention about 5-6 years ago, we put in a new pipeline. It was about 50 miles, so we took our things that we viewed as engagement at the time and tried to apply that. But then after the project was completely over, a year after, not right after, a year after, we went door to door and asked each landowner, how did we do? And it was very, very enlightening. And some things I think we did well, some things we need to do better. And it was really those discussions, that's the check and adjust that we need to have. And it does, in some ways, it doesn't need to be much more complex than that. You know, how well did we do some of those things? But it just, and again, the landowners were very honest. I will say, we did that through a third-party facilitator that we weren't even in the room, because we didn't want to hear what they might say. And so now they knew we were going to, you know, hear it or watch it, and it was very helpful.
Oh, sorry, I'll go to you next. Sorry.
Hi, thanks everyone. I was excited about the Honorable Jennifer's comment about learning. And I think the opportunity for learning comes from sharing the data and sharing the results. I saw that information sharing was one of the pieces of the pie. But I wonder if there is a possible addition to the model that would include sharing the results afterwards, or sharing the findings, or sharing the position. So what if each of the legs of the stakeholders, each of the stakeholders wrote like a paragraph summarizing their take on it? What if the year afterwards there was a summary and some sharing publicly of the documents and the findings? How could that help so that the findings weren't isolated to this, but became more broadly part of it and shared on the EPA website or something?
That's a great comment, and when you get a chance to actually read the document, you can see that some of that is built in there about how the industry does describe what they're doing and how they're doing, and even involving the public in some of those ongoing discussions. And like was mentioned, Chuck and I have been put on the implementation team to help bounce that out a little bit and to keep track of some of those things too. Anybody else have comments on that sharing?
I'll just mention, we learned this on the safety management system implementation. You need to have that, what have you done and what have you learned in it? And we actually did an annual report every year, and we still do it on safety management system. I don't want to put things or put more to do on Andrea's list, but I could see something like that in public engagement. What's that annual report? How far have we gone? Where do we need to go, and what's some of our learnings? Again, that was, and we would share that annual report with all the stakeholders, the three-legged stool. Do you agree with it? Hey, are we missing? I remember we would meet with NTSB. We would meet with PHMSA on SMS and go through that annual report. And they might say, you guys are missing this, or have you thought about this? So I could see that model being applicable here, but it's a good comment.
I can add. I'm certainly, I'm going to be going back to Pennsylvania Farm Bureau and probably American Farm Bureau and let them know we were asked to be involved in this, and this is the new process. So I would invite everybody to take a look at their local pipelines and say, yeah, they've got a new engagement thing. So just go ahead and call your local pipeline companies and let them know how well they're doing.
One of the things that we didn't mention is what the scope of this RP. There's over 3 million miles of pipelines in this country, and most of those pipelines are not included in this new recommended practice because we left out distribution pipelines, which makes up the vast majority. So this is transmission pipelines, gathering pipelines, not the distribution systems. And we did that because distribution is really a different beast than transmission, and in other political considerations, I'll just leave it at that. Now, AGA and the distribution people certainly were part of this, and we'll be looking at this and probably implementing it. And Alan certainly, if he decides to put it into the regulations, can rope in whoever he wants.
Carl, it may be also worth mentioning the difference in life cycles between the fact that 1185 covers the life cycle of a project as opposed to just in the ground, because I think that's really significant.
Go for it.
Yeah. So with 1162, which is the public awareness RP that's now code, outreach, landowner education, mostly, around hazards and location information is about projects that are only in the ground. And I think that's something that's really unique about 1185 is that it's meant to cover full life cycle from, the point of planning a project all the way to decommissioning a project, a pipeline, and having engagement strategies throughout that entire process. And also identifying how needs and concerns of the various publics that I talked about may change over the course of the life cycle of a pipeline project. And I think that that's really novel in that, I think, for instance, when I look at the FERC, certificate process for being able to, get approval for a natural gas pipeline, and you see, if you've ever looked at the flow charts, they say, oh, here's where the public engagement components are, right? And you look at how much happens in the course of a pipeline planning that before you even get to that first opportunity for public engagement, right? And so I see this as an opportunity for upstreaming engagement to the point where we can actually start getting dialogue before we start digging, before we start approving permits, right? And also getting to the point where we have a lot of aging infrastructure that's going to need to be replaced or just dug up and turned off. And what does that look like too? And how do we start planning for that sort of post-pipeline future in those communities, and what do they want done, right? We have to have that conversation too.
Carl, if I can add to that,
Sure.
we talked about siting, and the question was asked of me, but really what I had to flip in my mind as a local official was from the siting process to the operations process, from being adversarial with a pipeline now to being a partner with their operations. And it struck me earlier as Jennifer was speaking about safety, and the commercial airline industry, their safety level is almost unimaginable. To put 250 people in an airplane full of fuel and fly them, 2, 3 hours, 5 hours, 12 hours, and the safety level that they've achieved. So the process of operating these pipelines and the engagement you have with us as local officials, how important that is. And just imagine if you could do what the airline industry did, was to have zero accidents, to have zero fatalities, and how much easier your job will be when you can achieve something like that. It's what we're trying to do with surface transportation. The airline industry is this incredible model of doing something very dangerous and making it almost perfection of safety. It's incredible. So that should be, from my level, it's the operation side now that's super critical, because my job now is to protect the residents who have a pipeline nearby and keep them safe and peace of mind, right? Not only are they safe, but they know they're safe, right? And that's critical. And that's something that we can all be part of.
They're waving the 5-minute flag at me down here, but that means we have a couple more questions. And I was just going to say, if somebody asks a question, if you could introduce yourself and say where you're from, that would help the people on the webcast.
Hi, my name is Lisa Sorg, and I'm an environmental investigative reporter with NC Policy Watch, a nonprofit newsroom in North Carolina. And I have a question about a situation in North Carolina right now where Smithfield Foods and Dominion Energy are planning a network of biogas gathering lines, and they have for upwards of about 2 years refused to disclose to the state or to the public the proposed route of those gathering lines. They've not really justified their refusal. Sometimes they say national security. But I would be interested to know if any of you have encountered this with biogas, and if the RP is going to address biogas at all.
Want to try to take that jurisdictional one, Alan?
Well, biogas is certainly an issue we're dealing with these days. As far as the siting questions related to that, perhaps it's a local siting issue. I mean, from time to time we get questions about that, but I would funnel those through the local authorities there who are likely involved in that. But I'd be glad to talk with you or get someone who can talk with you to, further, get some answers for you.
Chuck?
Oh, by the way, excuse me, as far as the RP coverage for that, if it is covered by our regulations, by our oversight program, it would be covered by the RP. That's kind of the line we took, with the exception of distribution pipelines, the predominant piece. Hope that helps.
Yeah, so it would kind of depend on the size and the pressure of the pipelines, what they're operating at, but it sounds like they could be included.
I want to speak to the siting process generally, and I think it applies to that situation as well, is, historically with most new pipelines, the operator does their planning work in a black box, and shortly, not too long before they're ready to go to construction, they start trying to acquire properties. For most of the public, including local governments, that's the first time they know about the pipeline. They don't have any information about it. What this does, and this has been, to me, the big success of this RP, is getting siting into it, because that has been a no-go zone for the industry in these kind of discussions for as long as I've been involved, like 20 years. And this is new and really, really big. And I think that ultimately, my hope is, and belief, is that the industry will find this to be a good thing, to bring the public in, to bring local government in, much earlier in the process. We'll get pipelines that are in better locations, are safer to operate, and are safer for the public. And at first, I think this is going to be one of the big challenges for the industry, is to share that information early and to partner with landowners and public officials early. But I think ultimately this will benefit everybody, and the industry will find that this is a good thing. And I want to add is that hopefully this RP will have the industry sharing a lot of information. It's not intended to make everybody agree. That's not the intent. It's, as I said before, to have everybody having a discussion on a shared set of facts, on a common set of facts and information. And ultimately, hopefully that will reduce the level of disagreement, but also make it so maybe at the end of the day, you still disagree, but you can disagree without being as disagreeable.
We're out of time, I'm sorry.
Oh, can we, I saw Travis had his hand up and I'd like to hear from Travis.
Yeah, go ahead, Travis. There's a number of people, maybe before you speak, Travis, anybody that was involved with this RP, if they can raise their hand or stand up, because there's other people in the room from the industry and from government that were part of this too. So feel free to track any of these people down and ask them more if you're interested. Go ahead, Travis. Where's the mic?
I'm loud. I'm sure they can hear me.
Yeah, but they can't on the webcast.
But for me, when industry reaches out to me.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So first off, when industry reaches out to me beforehand, and a couple pipelines have done that. No pipelines in North Dakota have gone through Lake Sakakawea since I became involved without my concurrence. And so when they reach out to me, we go over designs, what we want. One of the biggest saviors for us has been HDD boring. So we no longer allow trenching into the lake. We demand that it be bored. And so by getting my dialogue, they're getting my support. And if they don't have that dialogue, then they're getting my opposition, and it hasn't, fared well for them. And that's kind of the point of this, is just to have the dialogue. Second, when we established our pipeline guidelines on our reservation, we had over 1 million gallons filled. We took it down to 0. We've established the best pipeline program in the nation, dealing predominantly with gathering lines. So for Allen, we're, like I said before, we're the pilot program. And by having this as guidelines, we had about a 90% improvement on it. And when we got to the code, then we went to 98%. So, I appreciate all you've done, but I do expect this to work. And the whole point of this with different groups is we want to have that dialogue beforehand. So it's a lot easier to tell a pipeline, hey, something culturally is significant to me. Can you please consider moving it before it's built? And it was a great experience. I appreciated everything. The only problem was it took us, 6-7 months to get to agreement and about 3 years to overcome the terminology. But I really appreciate everybody's help, and that's all I want to say.
Thanks, Travis.